All right, let's continue on. So the other thing I'm going to try to do a little bit is I'll drop in a few of these lines real thin just to kind of aid in the process and speed this up. So what I'm going to do, and this one actually has a small bow to it. That's another thing I think that's kind of helpful to do. You see I started to do that more with these bottom screens, mainly because they started to feel a little bit boring. So I was kind of in the middle of how advanced I wanted this information to look. Is this futuristic or is it just pretty modern for where we're at? Um, and that's always a tricky thing to figure out. Like it's really based on the narrative, so you have to really read into the story and see, okay, where what year is this and where are we at with our technological advancements and that kind of thing. But I think in this case, I wanted it to read like pretty current, but it's hard because even these days we have a very a lot of screens that are flat screen and don't even have a bezel to them. Um, and even with like a wall of computers, it's like how much is really buttons and how much is just like voice command. So there's all these choices to make when designing this stuff. So that's kind of what led me to start changing things a bit. I just felt like, well, it's a little too boring if I make everything square. I need to throw in some different shapes to the computers. That's why I added the different angles on the sides and the different shapes as I started. I think I started here and went over, and that's why I feel like the right side is a little bit more, I don't know about advanced, but it just has a bit more creativeness in the shapes. So with that, just kind of fixing some of these bad lines and picking some errors in the work. I feel like that one needs to be moved over. Now keep in mind too, you can move these over by adding your shadow to the one side like this. Then again, like I mentioned, switching to translucent, and you're basically nudging the line over. Instead of constantly erasing and redrawing, you start to get pretty creative at just kind of moving lines. Now obviously working digitally, you could just select and move the line, which makes it even faster, but I just kind of like to do that every now and then where I draw to one side, then erase to the other. And I do that a lot with faces because I feel like there's a lot of lines that get really close to the face or the correctness that I want. And instead of totally redrawing the line, I can save time by just, again, nudging the line. Works really well at things like, eyes and noses where the details are a lot smaller. And again, you can be pretty close to what you're after. So there's really not always a need to erase everything back. Okay, so now with this, as I work over to this, I want to try to retain that silhouette shape, and I think that's on a different layer. Yeah, so we're good anyways, because I could fill this all in to my heart's content, and then I could go back with a light silhouette line or a light gap, a white, kind of like a whiteout effect, white pen, and add a line back around that. So I'm kind of perceiving that she's on this like, keyboard thing that she's doing controls, and that's why her hands are up on it. So I'm just going to fill in some of these lines, and I'll probably do some separate divides here and there. So you see some of this information isn't there. I just kind of led up to it. Now primarily because I know I'm the one that's going to be inking it anyways, because I ink most of my own work, but at the same time, there's going to be, you're going to take liberty with that sometimes. There's going to be things that are missed in a artist's depiction. And again, you might want to verbalize it and say, well, I just think it would look better with some buttons here, some wires here. And most artists, I think, are just going to say, go for it. Just make it better. And I think one of the neat things about working digitally is it's very liberating in the sense that you can add things, and if they don't like it, it's pretty easy to edit. Maybe that's a bad thing at times too, because then it's like, your clients probably start to realize, or editors or whoever you're working with, hey, isn't it pretty easy to edit that since it's digital? Can you make this change, that change? So maybe it's a double-edged sword, but at the end of the day, if it gets you the best product, that should always be your goal. So don't get too too upset over changes, because it will actually hinder you in a lot of professional environments, probably all of them, because everything's going to require some changes. And again, I think that's what the real power of digital is, because changes are so much faster to make. Okay, so now let's get the edge of this one. See a little bit of edge over here. You see I've got some bumpy lines in there. I want to kind of fight the urge to fix every little thing, because every time you do that, you're trading this idea and thought of clarity in the work for an absorbent amount of time. And so you just have to be aware of what it's taking you to make these changes, and are they really necessary? You know, how much can you really just fix by rendering over top? Now, the other thing is this: if you find that this stuff is taking you too long and you want to speed up, another way to do that is just work with a larger brush. So the larger brush is going to kind of force you to make some different decisions, I think. So let's see if I scale this brush up and I start using bolder lines. They're going to read more quickly, which is nice. You know, they're a thicker, more aggressive line. But also I'm going to be a little bit less inclined to add in all these tiny details. And see, if you notice, even if I barely push down, I get a pretty heavy line here and there. So I think that leads, me personally, I would say it leads to making decisions quicker, and you know, it definitely makes a more readable line more quickly, which typically is what you're after, right? So you want these lines to be pronounced so that you don't have to constantly go back, and you see here they're very thin, and since this is up close to the viewer, these should be nice heavy lines. So if you get good at implementing heavy lines early on in the work, then it's going to save you some time, but it's going to cost you a little bit of your detail. So you have to like make these judgment calls on, you know, the look and style you're after, and you know what compromises you're making in the sake of getting it done on time. So it's very easy to just sit here and want to doodle and have fun with it, but I think a big part of inking and a big part of, you know, comic art in general is, you know, just really simplifying. Know when to simplify something, how to simplify something, make it read effectively and quickly. That's probably the hardest part. That's the part that I think most people are going to struggle with, because I think anybody, if they put their mind to it, can draw something pretty neat once in a while. But it takes a lot more to be able to constantly churn out storytelling on a timely basis. And that's where, you know, learning these techniques, these time-saving techniques, and these shorthand kind of interpretation, you know, simplification of work is so important. So little things like, you know, shadow on one side, a thinner line on the other, to kind of quickly convey, you know, depth on something, and a ridge, and you can kind of see I'm really drawing every line, and that's probably a mistake on my part, just want to be honest, because it really kind of helps the art when you get good at defining some of the lines, some of the top surfaces, by just implementing shadows. For this particular style, I don't really want to do that, but I do want to make you aware of it, that there's lots of styles where people just get insanely good at filling in the shadows, and a lot of these lines become almost not as necessary because the shadows do, you know, majority of the lifting. You know, you have to fill in some lines. It's got to read, but you got to remember that wherever light source is, generally you're going to have less lines. It just kind of bleaches out the line. I think we talked about that in the earlier lessons, and you want to use that to your advantage. Now for something like this, I feel like I need to kind of illustrate this a little bit in more, you know, focus and detail, but again, that could just be me in my perception of what something like this needs to look like. You know, we all have very different ideas of what a scene like this would consist of. So I'm just going to get a shadow on this one side to make it look recessed. And then these buttons. I think it's also kind of helpful to do somewhere, you know, some of these buttons where there's a line on each side, somewhere it's a thicker line. Basically just think about variation. Don't go through this entire illustration to make all these buttons the same, all these marks the same, because it'll take away from the flavor of it and the interest. Okay, so what else? We got some little noodling back here to do, just throw in some lines. You can kind of like fake detail as well by just having lines that are parallel and a variety of them. So again, that variation that you get, but notice how just by overlapping lines from a distance, it almost looks like detail when they're really just kind of haphazardly thrown in there. So play around with that too. You know, sometimes just think more textural, even about something like this, which is definitely more designed than throwing in random textures, but you can kind of convey that. Like the main thing I think is as long as the lines are horizontal or parallel to the back of the screens, it's just going to look like added detail. Now, if I just started to scribble in here, that's probably not going to read unless it was some kind of alien ship. You know, I could probably get away with that even. But as long as they're like little parallel and, you know, angled lines, they can kind of go in any direction. They can connect to other shapes, whatever. You could probably just get that to all read as more detail. You know, and really we could be filling in shadows back here. So I'll do that after we get the bulk of this in. I'll go back and just add some little shadows. So again, this little circuitry type stuff. Another line here for the next kind of set of panels. Make this line real thin by scaling it down with the bracket keys. And I will just have it, I'll kind of have it hide behind this screen, because if I bring it all the way down, you see it kind of exposes the difference of the two shapes. So to kind of cheat that, I'm going to make sure to have it hide below this other screen. I think it still shows the tilt on that other screen, but I don't think it's as bad. And rotate the screen. Now keep in mind, if this is hard for you to get these lines all straight from one another and kind of mimicking this angle that you get, you could draw all of these straight on a layer and then tilt the layer and then erase it back. So just remember, layers will really make stuff like this a lot easier. Again, I'm trying to just do this freehand because I feel like it teaches me more. So I want to constantly challenge myself to draw as much of this freehand as I can. So adding in some little details here. I don't know if I like that. It looks like a envelope or something. Let's just go with that for now. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap up this lesson here. I'm going to probably time lapse a little bit of this just because it's overly redundant. What I'm going to do is actually fill in the detail to the other side like we've done here. I'll talk about the process and then I'll stop briefly and we'll detail some of the little in-between areas. But again, it's going to be some of the same stuff we've talked about, using shift-click, drawing in some of the lines, making sure that lines are more bold as they become closer to the viewer, which I still haven't implemented enough of that yet. But as these things get closer and closer to the viewer, they're going to be, I'm going to use a lot heftier and thicker lines to convey that. So with that, let's move on to our next lesson.